This is House Planning Help, episode 261. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Duncan Baker-Brown from BBM Sustainable Design, and we're going to be looking at reducing waste and reusing materials. Also touching on the circular economy and explaining what that is. So at the time of recording this episode, it's about a month away from the global climate strike. And there've been protests in the past, no doubt there'll be protests in the future. But this one, for whatever reason, it feels quite significant. Perhaps it's been better organised as well. It's on everyone's mind because of the momentum that's been built up so far. And this all started with the children's school strikes, which were a regular thing. And now they're asking the adults to get involved. So I certainly want to do my bit, and I just thought I'd mention it to you because sometimes these things aren't even on your radar. Maybe you've got your head down and you look up and it's almost too late. So I thought I'd mention it here in the podcast. No doubt there'll be future events as well if you missed this one, but this is happening on the 20th to the 27th of September 2019 all around the world. So we'll report back on how we feel it's going, whether it's making any impact. Why I do this podcast, I think the solutions as well are one of the most interesting parts. That's raising the awareness of the struggles that we're facing, but there are solutions out there. You look in construction, we're constantly talking about how building better buildings, actually not only does it come with a load of benefits, but it solves these issues using less energy, less embodied carbon in your buildings. All these sorts of things have a huge impact if we could just work them into a solution. So we're sticking in the construction lane for now and trying to have an impact there. But the global climate strike, certainly an important thing that's going on and that should be on your radar. Now, today we are chatting to Duncan Baker-Brown, one of the directors of BBM Sustainable Design. And we've actually chatted to Ian McKay, the other director. It's a few years ago now. It was one of our early episodes, episode 47, all on choosing a property to eco-retrofit. That was at the point when I wasn't sure whether I was going to be building new or retrofitting, so I was finding out about both. So this is something that we haven't gone into detail with on the podcast before. How do we keep an eye on waste? How do we make sure we reduce that waste to an absolute minimum? Well, we're talking to the right person today. So let's have a quick intro first of all. I asked Duncan to tell me a little bit about his background.
I'm a practicing architect and have been for nearly 30 years. And for 25 of those 30 years, I've had my own practice called BBM Sustainable Design. So we're architects that focus on environmentally friendly solutions to architectural challenges. In addition to that, because in a way that's been quite cutting edge, we've researched and taught around those issues as well. So I teach at the University of Brighton in the School of Architecture and Design. I run research projects, and I've got a live practice as well. So we use the research to sort of inform our practice and vice versa.
Today, we'd like to focus very much on waste and reuse. Where does this topic begin, really? What's a logical beginning?
Well, for me, it begins in the fact that we're trying to reduce the amount of stuff we use in the construction industry when we're making things. And why am I interested in that? It's not just to save money, to reduce the amount of things you have to buy at the end of the day, but it's also from the environmental angle. So deforestation and destruction of the natural world to facilitate the mining of raw materials. And the construction industry pretty much consumes 50% of the annual materials that are mined and deforested, etc., around the world. So we are a huge consumer of raw materials. So if we can reduce the amount we consume, we can help the environment.
How much longer can we go on mining? Let's just pretend there weren't any issues. It seems like we're going crazy at the moment at a time when everything should be going the other way. We say, I'll tell you what, do some more.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a really scary time at the moment. We've got a lot of neoliberal populist leaders at the moment, showing off about how quickly they can chop down the Amazon rainforest, for example. However, soon after President Trump announced that the USA wouldn't be part of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, you've got California, which is now the 5th largest economy in the world, and New York State forming an alliance to do otherwise and commit to being net carbon zero by 2040. So, yeah, I think it's quite interesting times. I think you've got a lot of positivity as well as the negative stuff going on. It feels to me like a lot of national governments and leaders are ignoring the climate emergency, but at the same time, a lot of city-states, I'd say, and regions are doing the opposite. So, I think for me, the hope is with the city-states and regions just getting on with it, because they're the people suffering from the effects of the climate emergency at the moment. So, and if you're in the world of constructing things, we've got problems of resource security. Whether that's because of environmental problems or war zones or whatever. So materials are more and more difficult to get hold of. So if you're in a situation where you can reduce the amount of stuff you need on it for a construction project, you're going to be in a beneficial situation. And I'm looking at lots of real projects across Europe and some in the UK where people are using secondhand materials from old buildings to create new buildings. And this is quite inspiring for me.
Now, this is the idea of almost a circular economy, isn't it? Where you go from cradle to cradle. How easy is it? I know from my own experience, just thinking ahead of how I might have done that on my own project just gives me another headache on top of all the new things that we're learning.
Well, it is difficult, I think, to start these things up. But I think a lot of large corporate businesses are seeing the value in this. And I think until you've got larger organizations and local government legislation and supply chains assisting, it is very difficult for individual builders to embrace a circular economy. I mean, just to define what I think that is, that's in a world where there's one area's waste is what you might call the food or the valuable resource for another area. So there's no such thing as waste. There's just stuff in the wrong place. That's the sort of phrase I come up with. Now, with one-off houses, between 10 and 15% of all the materials and stuff that arrive on site get thrown away. So you're talking about the demolition waste on a typical project, as well as the new materials arriving on the site. And that's basically for every 6 or 7 houses we build in the UK, one house worth of stuff at the moment goes to landfill or incineration. In the UK at the moment, every year we buy 600 million tons of stuff. That's not just in the construction industry, that's just as UK citizens. And 200 million tons of stuff is thrown away every year. 120 million tons is from the construction industry. So 60% of everything thrown away every year is because of the construction industry. So we've obviously got to do something, and we need to do it at a sort of national, regional, local level. Now, for the self-builder, if you're in control of your building site, you're project managing it, I think that's in a way more straightforward, because you are deciding what's coming onto the site and how that stuff is managed. But typically, since the 1960s and 70s, it's been cheaper to throw material resources at a building site to keep it busy, rather than, for example, on a Friday morning running out of plaster and having your plasterers hanging around on site and having to pay them. So this is traditionally why we always overorder. We're really keen to, if you're ordering tiles, carpet, whatever it is, you always put in an extra 10% for wastage. And that's cumulative. You end up with this 10 to 15% of everything arriving on site being thrown away. And that's what we've got to avoid. So some of it in a way is quite straightforward. Order the material you need, plan your projects better, so there's a sort of tighter schedule, so you're not hanging around waiting for stuff, and really value the stuff that's arriving on site. It's all precious. You've paid for it. I mean, at the moment, we say that developers are hard-nosed, but at the moment, we've been able to convince developers to buy 15% more materials than they need just to throw away. I mean, 15% might be quite a good margin to get on a development in terms of profit. So at one level, it's quite strange that it's such a difficult sell to say don't create waste on site when you're just throwing away the money that you've invested in a project.
Yeah, when you say it like that, it makes a lot of sense, but I suppose they're thinking money, a lot of developers don't really even care of that final product. So it's about finish it, get on with the next one. And there's been no consequence, has there, for waste. So the explanation that you've just given is very much about almost how you shop well, full stop, isn't it? Would that be a way of saying it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's about shopping in a sort of smart way. I mean, we talk at BBM, we talk about doing a sort of resource map for a project. So understand where your project's sited, where the actual site of the project is. And then we literally, using Google Earth, we sort of do a radius from that site of sort of 1, 10, 20 kilometers, and we look at the resources nearby, whether that's a factory producing stuff or a woodland that's managed for timber or whatever, and look at plugging into local resources. And some of that, with our, in a way, more radical projects, could be a building site being deconstructed where we can get material off that construction site. So we're already doing it with real projects for one-off houses and such like. But it takes a sort of different mentality and sensibility. And the big deal is the time to sort of educate yourselves around the potentials of a circular economy to provide a better product at the end of the day, and have, you know, this amazing double whammy of being able to be beneficial to the environment as well.
If you're trying to be slightly clever and source closer to home, is it ever at the cost of performance?
Well, you want to make sure that it's not. I mean, in 2014, we completed the Brighton Waste House, and that's made out of, it's not a house, but it's the size of a house, and it's a house that performs to Passive House standards. And 90% of it is material other people threw away. And it only took a year on site, which is, from our experience at BBM, about the time that a one-off house does take. And to add to that, it was students building it. They were managed by experienced adults, as it were, but it was built by students. So we got a high-performing built project in the middle of Brighton. And, you know, it's, like I said, 90% of it is material other people threw away or overlooked and we're going to throw away. So I've got experience to say that it can be done. You have to use your time in a different way, looking for material. And then there are real issues around insurance and guarantee of using secondhand materials. So I think you really do need to be an experienced sort of architect or building contractor to understand the potentials for using secondhand material at the moment, because at the moment we don't have the legislation or the networks to support everybody doing it easily. So if you're doing a self-build project now, I would say just look at reducing waste to zero on site. That's the best thing to do. So don't throw away the materials that are arriving on site. Use techniques like prefabrication, whether it's SIPS panels or structurally insulated panels or whatever. Look at prefabrication. Avoid what we call the wet trades on site whenever possible. So as soon as you're mixing stuff with water on site, that's where you start to sort of create a lot of waste. I mean, often a skip is full of lots of different materials that are loose until the Friday afternoon, where the plasterer or the bricklayer or the person pouring concrete pours the waste concrete all over the other loose materials in a skip. And suddenly you've got this homogeneous lump, which there's no way you can reuse any of that. But until that point, let's say on the Thursday afternoon, it would have been material that could have been reused. And indeed, when we were doing the waste house, we were actually getting material out of skips to use. So it's all perfectly doable. But like I said, the message for self-builders is to reduce the waste on site.
So take SIPs that you mentioned in there. I mean, how does that have a second life after it's finished?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think if something arrives flat packed on the back of a lorry onto your site, and then you in effect screw it together, then one day it can be unscrewed. That's my point. And this is why prefabricated panels, I think, are really useful. At the end of the day, however individual we want our houses and buildings to look, a lot of them are built on various modules. And if you take it to the scale of offices, floor plates, sort of size of floor plates that are being built at the moment to house offices are pretty standard at the end of the day. So why am I saying this? Because one day those buildings could be deconstructed and reconstructed for other projects, and they'll probably be the right sort of dimensions for reuse. If you're building your house out of a prefabricated system, it's bolted together at the end of the day. So one day it can be unbolted and reused.
Okay. The circular economy, let's just focus on this for a second. So is this just part of the process, or can you describe what it is?
Well, for me, the circular economy is a sort of rebrand of sustainable design because it's got the economy word in it, but it's to do with this idea of being able to design things for perpetual reuse. So at the moment, we build things, and in the worst case, in sort of when you're constructing buildings in financial districts around the world, they might only have a sort of a business plan of 20, 25 years. So at the end of currently at the end of the building's 25-year life, you can imagine the sort of buildings that go up and down in the city of London. After 25 years, they're looking a bit tired, and so successful financiers will want those buildings stripped and thrown away, stripped down or demolished, and a new sort of flagship tower showing off how prestigious the business is built. Now, I know of there's the AMB AMRO Bank, which is a national bank in Amsterdam. They've just built something called their Circle Pavilion, which was an £18 million Circle Pavilion. And that is a building that's a material store for the future. It's designed so it can be deconstructed in 20, 30, 40 years' time. And the bank are seeing that as an investment. So at the end of that building's life, instead of being a sort of financial deficit where it's just something that you need to pay for to be demolished, it's actually a pile of materials and systems and components that can be sold off to other people or reused for other projects. So it makes financial sense at the end of a building's life that you can deconstruct it, because then you've got the material assets to sell or to reuse. Therefore, you'll save money instead of sending it to landfill or whatever, which is the old-fashioned way of doing things. So it makes financial sense, a circular economy. And I think for a lot of people, they're intrigued by it. It's literally because it's got the economy word in it. But for me, it's this idea of in a future circular economy, there'll be these two spheres, the biosphere and the tech sphere. And the biosphere is everything that's made out of natural materials. And ultimately, those natural materials can be designed to be remade again and again and again. But one day they'll become compost for the natural world. Timber will rot in the ground and become compost. The other sphere is the technosphere. So that's all the technological gadgets that we've got, smartphones, etc. And obviously, they're not something that can never decompose. So these are the things where we've really got to work on how to design them so they can be deconstructed and reused again. But what's interesting, just a couple of little facts, is that at the moment we have the technology to reuse and recycle 95% of our smartphones. We just choose not to. And another nice statistic, which goes back to this idea of mining the Anthropocene, reworking what's out there already, you can get more gold out of a ton of smartphones than you can get out of a ton of the best gold ore from mines. So why send people underground to, in those dreadful conditions to mine more gold ore, when actually all those rare minerals and composite materials, and including gold, that are in our smartphones that are thrown away every year, just collect those and get the rare metals out of those.
So how is landfill management changing, or how has it changed? Because if I understand you correctly there, what you're saying is actually there's a lot of gold that's just going straight into landfill.
Well, actually, there's a lot of gold that's just going to, India and Ghana and places in Africa that you've got children and other people just trying to sort of tug out of old smartphones in a very informal, environmentally unfriendly way. So what I'm actually saying is that another thing about the circular economy is this idea of corporate responsibility. So, for example, if you make something, if you're a manufacturer of a car or a phone or whatever it is, you have the responsibility of taking back the thing at the end of its first generation of use. So that's something that needs to happen.
That's good, isn't it? That really puts the onus back on them.
Because at the moment, it's the responsibility of the end user to informally or formally.
Oh, that would be good with developer houses, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
You get it back at the end.
Well, no, exactly. But but that's this idea of buildings as material banks, because they would, if they were designed as material banks, they'd want them at the end of their life because they'd be an asset. So at the moment, they're just seen as something that, it's a 3-4 year plan where they sort of buy land, build something and get rid of it and have no responsibility apart from a little bit of liability for 6 years or whatever. So, I mean, there are people out there, and this is especially, it's gaining sort of leverage and traction in Europe, especially in the Netherlands, where people are looking at the idea of leasing facades on buildings, and the idea that you'd lease the materials of a building. So the supplier of the materials, in effect, would lease them to you. At the moment, you can lease light fittings from Philips, and they call it their lease lux scheme. So the owners of the buildings don't own the light fittings, Philips do. What the owners have is a lease agreement with Philips that guarantees the level of lux, the sort of brightness of a room. And it's up to Philips for 10 or 15 years to provide that correct level of light. Now, what's that all about? Why is that a benefit to anybody? Well, to Philips, they've got these lease agreements for quite a long time, which is good. But what it does for the end user is make sure that Philips probably supply you with their best, most robust light fitting, because they don't want to be coming to your building every 6 months to change a light bulb. But also at the end of that light fitting's life, Philips take the light fitting back. They want the resources to make new light fittings. So what will eventually happen, and is already happening, is that Philips would design light fittings that are easy to dismantle, easy to take apart, so they can recycle some of it and reuse other components. And from a design point of view, and that's whether you're designing a light fitting or a phone or a building, it needs a different sort of way of designing. You have to think about it differently, because you're thinking about how to take apart the thing that you're assembling as you're designing it.
It makes sense for them, and you've talked about the financial benefit because they're leasing it, it's their own material. Why are more people not going down that route? What is stopping them? Is it just they're not innovating enough?
Well, it's just a really interesting time at the moment, because I wrote a book called The Reuse Atlas, subtitled A Designer's Guide Towards a Circular Economy, 2 years ago. And it had about 35 case studies of different products and buildings, all as examples of going down this sort of circular economy route. So I was interested in people who are actually doing it and not just talking about it. And there were examples of buildings in the UK that did this, but a lot of it is happening in the Netherlands. But what my point was actually that since that book was published 2 years ago, there are so many more amazing projects doing just this. So there's a project in Denmark called Resource Rose, which is I think about a 70-unit housing scheme. Because it's in Denmark, they're all leased. Nobody's owning them, but this building is clad in brickwork from old buildings. So these are 1960s buildings where the mortar joints of the brickwork are cement based, so they're stronger than the bricks. So traditionally, if you have to demolish or deconstruct a 1960s brick building, you can't reclaim the bricks, you just get rubble. If you're looking at a 19th century or 18th century building, because they've got lime-based mortar, you can reuse the individual bricks really easily. So what the Lendiger group did, that's the name of the people that have done this building, they literally got a diamond angle grinder, a diamond-headed angle grinder, and they cut these 1 meter by 1 meter square panels out of the building that was going to be demolished. And then they reused those panels, which stick together as square panels of bricks and stay together because the mortar's so strong, and put them on the new building.
Wow.
So, and this is quite a big building, and there are other ones. You know, I've got some colleagues at the moment in Brussels who are deconstructing the part of the Brussels World Trade Center, big buildings that would normally, no one's ever liked them. They're just a financial proposition built 20 years ago. They're out of fashion now, so the owners want them to be rebuilt. And these guys called Rota DC, standing for deconstruction, are in there carefully dismantling the building, and they're selling the components.
Let's say there is something on our sites then that for one reason or another has to go. Now, this might just happen automatically via our contract or whatever, but how can we make sure that that gets used again or as much as possible? Is there a way?
Well, there's a way, but it's going to, there is a way. I mean, if you're talking about reusing stuff on site instead of throwing it away, if you've got the normal time constraints, i.e. you're in a rush and every day matters and the building site's live, I think it's very difficult to do that. But there are networks out there that will accept secondhand material in the UK. So FreeCycle is one, and Freegal is my preferred one. And Freegal were the organization we used when we were building the waste house. So there are emerging networks out there, and I think there'll be others coming on board really soon, because we are suddenly in quite a different environment from the beginning of the year. Our parliament's declared a climate emergency, and okay, we've got the Brexit distraction at the moment, but actually there's a lot of people out there who are thinking, right, we've got to respond to this. And the way the construction industry can do this is by reducing its consumption of stuff. So I think that we're going to have an update in building regulations, British standards, etc., that will demand and facilitate the reuse of stuff. So, for example, at BBM, well, I mean, we're sort of specialists in this. We've got a project on that's about to go on site where the original house unfortunately burnt down. It's at the top of a hill. There's a sort of lane to it. It's really difficult from point of view of access. So we had really large quotations for taking the burnt bricks, because it was a brick and timber house, taking the burnt bricks off site. And it's actually easier if we just crunch up the bricks on site and make new tiles out of those bricks, which is what we're going to do. So, in that case, because of the particular situation, it is more advantageous to recycle the damaged material on site rather than take it off site. But I have noticed on larger projects that a lot of demolition companies are sort of rebranding themselves deconstruction companies.
That's what I was wondering, whether that sort of service existed. So yeah,
it's happening. Yeah. So, for example, there's a large development in Brighton of new student housing, etc., etc. Big development. It's called Preston Barracks, and I think over 95% of the material that was on that site is still on that site. It's been recycled, and by coincidence, there was a Victorian barracks building that was deconstructed quite slowly, and the tiles off that building we used on a project of our own at BBM, and we didn't even know it was the Preston Barracks tiles, but we were doing an extension on a listed building, and they needed secondhand tiles, and they got them from Preston Barracks. So that was really interesting. A site I was watching being deconstructed actually supplied material to one of our new build projects. So it is happening, and WRAP, which is the government organisation, Waste and Recycling Organisation, has sort of rebranding themselves to be experts around the circular economy, which they are. They'll say that 20% of the construction industry is already circular. So there are already networks and systems out there for reusing materials. And for example, large contractors, really large ones, the sort of Wilmot Dixons and Robert McAlpines of this world, they will be swapping materials internally. So, they'll have large sites, and it's so easy to have surplus materials on big sites. You could easily have 200 sheets of plasterboard or whatever that you don't want, and traditionally it would be easier to throw them away. But actually, because of their internal networks now, I know that Murphy's are doing it as well. They're swapping surplus materials amongst their own sites, and I think it's only a matter of time, literally a couple of years, before these large contractors will start swapping with each other. So, if you can imagine a sort of in the city of London where there's a tower going up and another one going down, those two sites just need to talk to each other.
Can you tell us a little bit more detail about the waste house, and whether, if you were doing it today, it would be identical, or whether anything would have changed?
Yeah, a lot would have changed. I think the waste house was designed as a concept in 2011, 2012. And initially it was going to be the rebuild of something called the house that Kevin built that I did on Channel 4 over 10 years ago. And the house that Kevin built was a prefabricated house that was built in 6 days using, whenever possible, just organic replenishable materials. So straw, wood, reeds, hemp, everything was organic. And the issue behind that is that organic stuff, when it grows, locks carbon. And also there was a big rush to burn logs and stuff, log burning stoves. So people were thinking that was a green thing to do, which we all know it isn't now because of air pollution, and also the amount of carbon in our air. So what we were doing is promoting the fact that these organic materials could be sophisticated, prefabricated, etc. And we did that. And then it was only assembled for 2 days and then deconstructed. It was zero waste on site, but the idea was to rebuild it at the University of Brighton, where I teach. And that didn't happen. It went off to the University of Bath. So we had a site for the house, but we didn't have the house. So then we had the opportunity to look at something else. And it was then where we looked at trying to build something out of what was in 2012 for every 5 houses we were building, you got 1 house worth of landfill or the waste going to landfill or incineration. So it was worse than the amount of waste we make in the construction industry is actually reduced by about 30% in the last 10 years, which is good. So we then thought, well, why don't we just prove that we can build a high performing sort of passive house out of this material that normally goes to landfill incineration? So we did that. And one of the big deals was that we were using it as a learning exercise, a teaching tool for students. So we had 1 or 2 adults with lots of experience plus lots of students. And that was good. But while we were developing the design and on site, we partnered Freegal UK, who are this online swapping of unwanted stuff agency, and they have nearly 3 million subscribers. And Kat Fletcher, who was one of the founders of Freegal UK, she said, why don't we raise awareness of the stuff that we throw away on a day-to-day basis, so not just in the construction industry, but in our everyday lives? And so that ended up being, just to cut to the chase, an awareness raiser of plastic bags that we throw away, toothbrushes, all the nasty plastic stuff that everybody's very well aware of now. So what happened with the Waste House is it changed from being a project that proved that construction waste was valuable to a project that became more of a polemic and a thought provoker. So, for example, we designed the house so it's like a container for these waste products. So we use all these plastic waste products as low-grade insulation. And we've got these sort of what we call cassettes, which look like wardrobes that form the walls. And in these walls, we've got things like 4,000 VHS videos, like from the 80s and 90s, things that you've forgotten about, but that are still there. Most plastic ever produced is still with us. We just forgotten where it is, or turning a blind eye to it. So this is before Blue Planet 2 with David Attenborough and the greater awareness of plastic in our oceans, etc. So the Waste House became this sort of polemic and thought provoker. It's not a house, it's a teaching studio on campus at the University of Brighton. We have schools coming to use it. It's open to whoever wants to use it, and we use it ourselves. So it's basically this sort of vessel holding lots of products that have been designed without an end-of-life strategy. So we have a lot of design students and architecture students at the University of Brighton, so they can come to the Waste House and see things that, like we've got 25,000 toothbrushes that we collected in only 4 days from Gatwick Airport. So we got these toothbrushes that were being cleaned out of airliners as they landed at Gatwick Airport. In only 4 days, we got 25,000 toothbrushes, all of them never used. So from our point of view, these are daft products that should with no end-of-life strategy. So the Waste House at the moment is a thought provoker. Your question was, what would I do it the same again? No, I wouldn't. If I did it again, I would do the resource map for construction and other materials to make a building that's a material store for the future that can be dismantled for the future. The Waste House can be doing that. But I'm not saying we should build our houses out of toothbrushes and things like that, because at the end of the day, plastic is toxic waste. So even though, weirdly, the Waste House, the sort of DNA of the Waste House is treated timber plus plastic, which is what a lot of houses are made of. I'm not a big fan of plastic in our buildings, so I'm certainly not saying that's what we should do. But what I'd like to do is a project where maybe we find a building that's unwanted, and we deconstruct it and then reconstruct it with new owners, new use, new site. And the architectural challenge, apart from the deconstruction and reconstruction, would be to how to tweak the building so it accommodates the new criteria and new standards for insulation and energy reduction and that sort of stuff. So that's the project I would like to do next.
Well, it's fantastic to hear that you're still thinking of new projects, and you seem to pop up everywhere at the moment. You're obviously doing a good PR circuit.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are wanting to understand what to do, because so many local authorities, NHS trusts, like I said, are not our government, but our parliament declared a climate emergency. So it's all very well to do that, but what do you do next? So my real message is if you want to benefit the environment, is to reduce the consumption of stuff in your everyday lives, as well as if you're in the world of construction, with the materials that are arriving on site and going off site as well. So I'm trying to communicate a really clear message, because a lot of people are going to be crunching carbon numbers, etc., and trying to be carbon neutral and all that sort of stuff. And I just think that's really difficult. I think to understand how to really do it, and I think it's a lot more straightforward just to say carbon's one of the things we've got to reduce, but we've really got to reduce the amount of water we use, the amount of energy we use, and the amount of materials and components that we use to when we're designing, building, inhabiting, maintaining, and ultimately deconstructing the built environment that we live and work and play in.
Duncan, thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to speak to you.
Get more online in our show notes today, which you'll find at houseplanninghelp.com/261. You can review the main information once again in the summary that we provide. We'll also link you across to BBM Sustainable Design's website. We'll show you where you can buy yourself a copy of the Reuse Atlas. That's Duncan's book from a couple of years ago. And if you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, there's a place to do that right at the bottom of the show notes. Just scroll down. houseplanninghelp.com/261. My call to action is to check out the Hub, and this is the membership community that I set up a couple of years ago now, and the idea being that we just want to help you on your self-build journey. We've been adding different videos to our vaults. We've been holding conference calls, live training sessions, just different ways of trying to learn as much as you can going into the process. But the section actually I wanted to talk about today was our forum. So obviously this is a place to post up things you're struggling with, to discuss issues, but there's a section to keep your own progress log. And the idea behind this is, well, a big one is accountability. And I did this through my build as well. You can also go back and look at people who have achieved their goals, who've got to the end, and read through what they have done as well, and some of the highs and lows. So it gives it a very good snapshot, but it also makes you realize, oh my goodness, I am moving forwards. I'm further than I think I am. And it's a place where we can support you and see what your latest challenge is. I have decided that I need to start one for my next project. You know, this is the project that's in research mode at the moment, but that is exactly how we like it, because I need to be kept accountable too, so that I'm driving this forward. So if you're one of our members, I'd like your input as well as I start that up. Check it out in the forum, houseplanninghelp.com/join. If you're not a member, we'd love you to sign up, and hopefully we can help you on your journey. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.